The following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Access Television, the City of Oshkosh, the Oshkosh Cable Television Advisory Commission, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everyone, welcome to Eye on Oshkosh. Cheryl Hentz here along with Dan Rylance, and we're very pleased to be joined this evening by Todd Berry. Todd is the president of the Wisconsin Taxpayer Alliance, and Tom's been good enough to drive up from Madison to talk with us about the budget, who the winners were, who the losers were, and a new press release that just came out within the last few days from Representatives Nelson and Gordon Hentz. So welcome, Todd. Thanks very much for being here. We appreciate it.
It's been a while since I've been doing Oshkosh TV things. So.
Well, we're pleased to have you, and happy that our show is one of the ones that you're doing. We're going to talk about all the different aspects of the budget, which there are several, but one of the first things that I guess maybe we should just talk about and kind of get out of the way is last week, Friday, and we're taping this the following Thursday, Representatives Tom Nelson and Gordon Hentz had issued a press release, and basically they're just saying after a 115-day impasse in getting this budget through, it's time to do some kind of a budget reform package. And they are proposing this. They're saying that because of the impasse, 6,000 students didn't receive financial aid, school districts, local government were unable to write budgets, 800 public employees were scheduled to be furloughed, and critical road and bridge projects were delayed. One of the things that they're proposing here is that anyone seeking state office and has filed the appropriate papers with the Elections Board may not fundraise during the budget writing process. They want to compel the attendance of budget conference committee members as outlined in Assembly Bill 551. And this is a kind of an interesting one, I thought. They want to withhold legislator pay after August 1st if a budget has not passed. What do you think about all this?
Well, first of all, just maybe a practical political consideration. Because both of those legislators happen to be in the minority in that House, and if their party is in the majority in the Senate, by the way, so it would be this in reverse in the other House, the proposal probably won't go anywhere because the committee chairs are of the opposite party. My sense of this is that if you want to fundamentally get at the budget problem and a lot of other political problems, you could very easily do it by doing what an awful lot of states do, the vast majority, and simply say after a certain date the legislature's not in session and it's going to go home. I'm not suggesting meeting 10 days every 3 years or something, but you know, by July 1, when the budget was supposed to pass, between 38 and 41 state legislatures were out of session and home. And I think that, you know, that's enough time to do your work. And just like students don't want to do their homework if they don't have a deadline, I think maybe a deadline would be the simplest and cleanest way to do it. Now, an issue of fundraising during a budget, you know, it's really sort of a separate issue, and I think we've seen bills on that many, many times. I don't understand why they haven't gone anywhere. It would seem to be something that both parties could agree on. Docking pay, there's been some question about whether that would be constitutional in Wisconsin, because lawmakers are not allowed to accept a change in their pay during the session they're elected for. Well, changes can go up or can go down.
Sure.
The one thing that the legislature could do, I suppose, is escrow that pay and not pay it until they. But you know, the other big solution is to say, well, if we had a part-time, you know, old-style Wisconsin citizen legislature, they would have to go home because they'd have to milk the cows, sell insurance, practice law, whatever they do. And that would be another way to sort of address the problem. You know, it depends on how you want to go at it.
Sure, sure. So you think this is just kind of politics and
well, you know, I
probably well-intended, but not really.
Yeah, I mean, there's a
there?
lot of proposals that are coming from legislators to do all sorts of things, and you know, I don't want to suggest that people are have any motivation that's not a good motivation, but I'm just in practical terms and in terms of what would probably be the simplest way to get at the problem. I think some other, you know, more fundamental changes would do the trick probably.
Okay.
Couple questions. Would you set the sine die time to end at the beginning of the session? How would you do that?
Well, it depends on how you want to do it. Some states do it in their constitution. I'm not a huge fan of, you know, putting everything but the kitchen sink in a constitution. That said, the problem in Wisconsin is when you write those kinds of things into statute, the history is that the legislature and the governor simply rewrite the statute, you know, amend the statute as part of their budget and just push the date back. If I mean, they could do that tomorrow. The leadership sets schedules already for when they're meeting and when they're not meeting. It wouldn't be hard to, as the first act of business, simply have a you know, pass a House or Senate rule or a statute that would set a time fixed. I suppose once you had that in place, if the media were doing its job, it would remind them that they had set a date for themselves, and if somebody wanted to change it, they'd probably be open to criticism. But if you want to assure it, the only way you can probably do it is in the Constitution.
Now, legislative leaders, these things to me sound more like changes that are rules of the legislature rather than something that ought to go in law. You know, if they were interested in progressive reform for the legislature, they could be out front to change the rules of the legislature.
Yeah. Realistically speaking, though, it's the majority party in each house that sets the rules for the session. You know, it's the majority party that elects the speaker in the assembly or the leadership in the Senate.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, the UW system was one of the big winners in the budget, and Wisconsin Public Broadcasting was another, and of course the city of Madison, which doesn't really affect us a whole lot, but you know, we'll talk about it anyway. The UW system, let's talk about that. When I talked with Chancellor Wells from UW Oshkosh, he indicated that they got the single largest budget increase in the second year of the biennium of any comprehensive university to move forward so that more of their citizens can, you know, get a better education and that kind of thing. It's going to allow them to employ at least another 24 tenured and tenured track faculty members in specifically in high demand areas, high demand, high need areas. So why don't we talk a little bit about exactly what this budget does for the UW system as a whole, and maybe if we can kind of zero in a little bit on UW Oshkosh.
Well, the GPR, the general fund money for the university, did go up. I don't think that was ever in doubt. We had an assembly budget that nicked the university. We had a Senate budget that didn't. We had a Senate budget that had a $15 billion health plan. We had an assembly budget that didn't. I mean, what this was really about, public broadcasting law, you know, get rid of state funding for the law school on the assembly side, or major health care expansion on the Senate side were bargaining positions. I wouldn't say they were ever serious, and anybody that suggested they were just, lining up the chips for bargaining. And sure enough, all that stuff fell by the wayside. In the case of the university, again, I would agree that the general fund appropriation went up. However, I think I would disagree that I would call this a big win for the university system, and I'll tell you why. And that is, if you look at the history of state general fund spending for the university, not adjusting for inflation, just in raw dollars, it grew through the 90s and peaked in about 2001-2. The governor's first budget back in 03-05 cut the university by $250 million. And the university was allowed to recover some of that through tuition increases, which were pretty big. So if you follow the history of all this, what you conclude is that the university system's GPR funding with this budget is no greater than, and probably less than it was in 2001. And if you adjust for inflation, it's obviously lower. So it's compared to what? I mean, compared to 2001, it's about the same. Compared to 2003, it's an increase only because 2003 was so bad for the university.
It's kind of a catch-up budget a little bit.
In some respects, yeah. But again, in inflation-adjusted terms, it really continues a 30-year trend of shift in budget allocation. And we did some work on this earlier this year, and the bottom line is, for the last 30 years, the big winners in state budget fights have been K-12 school aids and Medicaid, which has been the real big winner in the last few budgets. And the losers have been the municipalities and counties whose shared revenues as a share of budget have been declining, and in raw dollars have really not gone up for 10 to 15 years.
Corrections has gone up too, right?
Corrections is, well, I just wanted to finish the thought. The other big loser has been the university system. Back in 1970, the university was receiving 17% of the state budget. It's now receiving 7% of the state budget. So in a broad historic sense, there have been winners and losers, and the university has tended to not be a winner. You mentioned corrections. That's sort of an interesting story, because in about 1990, we were probably spending maybe 1% of the state budget on corrections, and compared to other states, we were a pretty low spending state on corrections. With a whole mess of sensational crimes and so forth in the early 90s, the legislature and governors got all excited and got tough on crime. And at the same time, we were in a surge of the one part of the population that does crime, males, 16 to 25. For those reasons, we had a lot of pressure on the corrections system during the 90s, and we didn't have the beds to house these people. So what the state did during the 90s was it built prisons and it staffed them with guards. And so, yes, in a percentage terms, the corrections budget grew more than any other major appropriation during that period. In raw dollar terms, it didn't come close to, say, school aids, and the reason simply was it was such a small part of the budget. But the bottom line is it's gone from about 1% of the budget to maybe now 7%. But that rapid growth really plateaued starting in about 2001. And I mean, it bumps up and down, but overall, corrections spending has been growing probably at or less than the rate of the overall budget in the last 6 years. So there was this rapid rise. They sort of built and staffed, and now they're more or less in a cost to continue kind of mode.
Okay.
Could I ask for our viewers, what's the total amount in this 2008-2010 budget? How many $1 billion are we talking about?
Yeah. Billions and billions, as I think Carl Sagan used to say. We have sort of two budgets. The first is the general fund or general purpose revenue or GPR budget. That's the one that the press talks about, the legislature talks about. And that's because that's where virtually all the taxes we pay go. I mean, income, sales, and so forth. That is running per year around $14 billion, a little less in the first year of the two-year budget, a little more in the second year. So, you know, we're talking something in the order of magnitude of, you know, 28 billion over 2 years, or, you know, plus or minus. If you look at the entire budget, what's called the all funds budget, there's a lot of federal money flowing through. There's a lot of segregated revenue, tuition, driver's license fees, and so forth. If you add all that in, then on a yearly basis, that doubles, or actually more than doubles, to about 28, 29 or so billion. I'm being very crude here. And over a two-year basis, then where we ended up was with a budget of about 57 plus billion. So a long answer to a short question, but so GPR 2 years, you know, 26, 27, all funds 57.
Okay, one more arithmetic question. For our viewers, could you go through the 3 or 4 main ticket recipients and what percent of the budget they are? Just to get an idea.
This is really important because the public doesn't understand it, and in fact, nobody understands it almost, and it's really very important. If you look at the general fund budget and look at the share of certain major programs between school aids and related tax credits, they're about 44% of the budget. And that percentage keeps growing. After that is Medicaid, which is pushing 15% of the budget, and has jumped dramatically in recent years. It used to be less. It used to be less than 10%. Okay. So, right with those two programs, Medicaid and school aids and related credits, you have almost 60% of the budget, and then. There are a couple appropriations that drop down in magnitude to roughly $1 billion a year, give or take, or 6, 7, 8% of the budget, and that would be the university, corrections, and shared revenues. Now, some are a little bigger than others, but of those 5, you're probably around 80% of the budget. Everything else is, as they say, chicken feed. and the thing that people don't, I do a lot of speaking around the state, and if you take questions at Rotary clubs or whatever, and they'll say, well, what does the state spend money on? They presume it's the university or the bureaucracy, or prisons, or welfare, the things that they are salient to them.
So those legislators getting all that money staying there.
But when you add up all the aid programs and credit programs and so forth, you've got 60 to 65% of the state budget in one way or another subsidizing local government, school districts, the property tax. So what the state budget's really about is relieving property taxes. Something people don't.
Aside from the increases this year, what's different about this budget from previous ones? If you had 2 or 3 things, you've been here a long time. What's different about this biennium budget, say, on past ones, if anything?
I would call it very much a sort of status quo budget, very similar to the last 3 or 4 biennia, and the chief similarity is that the state doesn't have a lot of extra money sloshing around because on their official books, they're running deficits, and so the expenditure growth is always fairly modest. They always have a structural deficit that they carry forward that they have to fund before they do anything new. And they're always balancing the budget, at least on paper, by taking money from some kitty that rescues them for another biennium. In 2001, we bonded tobacco industry money. In 2003, the governor took $700 million out of the transportation fund. In 2005, through his, what the press has labeled the Frankenstein veto, he took $400 and some million out of the transportation fund and put it in school aids. And in this budget, we have the $200 million from the Patients' Compensation Fund, which the doctors have already sued the state on. So, unfortunately, maybe I'm just becoming too cynical, having watched this for 10 or 15 years. But there's the budgets of the last, say, 3 or 4 biennia are really very similar in terms of the amount of growth. Who wins, who loses, and the mischief that's engaged in to at least balance the budget on paper.
Well, let's talk about winning and losing, the possibility of the doctors winning and losing their lawsuit. Now, you know, obviously that's not going to, the way our court systems move, this is going to be tied up in litigation for probably an extremely long time. Certainly, I would say longer than the biennium is good for. Let's say at some point down the road the doctors prevail. I would assume the state would appeal and that would go on and on and on. But for sake of discussion right now, Todd, if the doctors win, then what happens?
Yeah. Well, there are 2 items in the budget that are being litigated. One is the $200 million for the Patients' Compensation Fund, which, for those that don't know, is an attempt to keep the damper on medical malpractice costs and to keep physicians in the state. That fund, the doctors would argue, and it's been like this since its founding in the mid-70s, is money from healthcare providers put into this fund to provide them a safety net should they face some large malpractice suit. The doctors argue, therefore, that it's not public money. It's certainly not tax money, and the state may hold it in trust, but it's really their money. The last time something like this was tried, Governor Thompson went into the state employee retirement fund, if I recall, and
lost, did he?
And he lost eventually. And so what happened was, eventually, the state had to pay back the fund it raided, the original amount plus interest. And I'm not a lawyer, but the Constitution says that government can't take private property, and that's one of the arguments I think the doctors will make. And again, from my perspective, it's probably a compelling argument. It may be a long time before they win, but I would say if I were rolling the dice or whatever, I would bet on the doctors rather than the state. So at some point down the road, we're going to have a budget with a hole in it, 200 plus interest hole in it. And of course, there's another litigation going on with tribal gaming revenue between the Ho-Chunk and the state. There's $75 million that the governor and the legislature are counting as revenue that the Ho-Chunk say, the state isn't entitled to. So you've got, a budget that's, even if you assume that it's in balance by the $3 or $4 million they tell us it's in balance, you've got $275 million in litigation. So it's a budget not unlike prior budgets. There's always some question marks.
We're always robbing Peter to pay Paul, it seems.
Well, or robbing Peter and Wanda and Frank, and, transportation fund, recycling fund, I don't know.
Indian gaming is a little more complex in that it's also a federal issue too, isn't it? I mean, the National Indian Gaming Act of 88 or 89 set this up. And many Indian scholars argue that the Indians constitutionally shouldn't have to give these governors who force them to sign these compacts one dime. So, I mean, it's more complicated than just a state issue.
And the state opened the door. I mean, when the voters decided that they wanted to have a lottery in Wisconsin, because it was getting into the gaming business in some way, and I don't remember the details of the Federal Gaming Act, but the long and the short of it is, that is what opened the door to the tribes then going into the gaming business, and the federal government views the tribes as sovereign.
That's right. It's in the Constitution.
And so the deals that they have cut with the state, they've done because maybe it made good public relations sense, or they didn't want to fight a long political battle or whatever, but they felt that having the authority to do gaming, some people thought in perpetuity, there's another fight between the governor and the legislature, that they apparently thought that that was a good enough deal in order to decide to give the state some revenue. Are they giving the state a lot of revenue? Not in the context of their operations. We're talking about $1 billion+ industry, and I think the state budget is counting something in the neighborhood of $50 to $100 million of revenue. So, that's percentage-wise, that's pretty small.
Okay.
This is the only tribe, though, that's not following through on the compact.
Well,
or are there more than one?
I believe so,
Okay.
but of course, a number of the tribes are pretty small,
Yeah, and their profits aren't very big,
and
are
their
they?
gaming operations are really small.
Yep. Yeah.
Earlier, Todd, you mentioned property taxes, and let's talk about that for a little bit. You know, for the last few years, we've had this 2% cap on the levy freeze. This time around, Governor Doyle has raised that to 3.86% for the first year of the biennium. I should say 3.86%, or the net of the increase in
New
property
construction.
taxes for new construction,
Yeah.
whichever is greater.
Yeah.
So that's the levy for the first year, and then in the second year it's 2%,
Right.
or again that new construction percentage, whichever is greater. You know, I'm sure the municipalities are very pleased with this, but you know, it doesn't help the individual taxpayer a whole lot, or does it? Because what we saw here in Oshkosh was the city, you know, trying to institute things like garbage fees and so forth to make up for the loss in the levy.
Yeah.
So, you know, is the property tax person, the property owner, really a winner here or not?
I'm a little bit dubious, and more for sort of philosophical reasons than anything. I really think that property taxes are a wholly appropriate way to fund municipal government. Service to property, fire, police, garbage pickup, street, whatever. And so I view the property tax for municipal purposes as sort of a user fee. And if that's the case, the same folks that have expressed a desire to have some kind of levy limit on municipalities are the same ones that are concerned about the shift to fees. And I haven't done formal research on this, but I would bet money, a lot of money, that the net revenue coming into municipalities from the property tax plus the new fees is probably greater and growing greater than the property tax had in the past. At least that's been our experience in monitoring other kinds of things like this. Plus, and this is what really concerns me, is that the beauty of municipal finance right now is you pay a property tax, you know what you get. This whole moving off into borrowing or fees really makes the public budget much harder to follow and understand. And you know, I'm not arguing we should spend more or should spend less, but I will argue very strongly that public budgets at all levels should be transparent, and that people should know exactly what's going on, and whether it's fund transfers and stuff at the state level or new fees on the municipal level, I don't think that it makes government easier to understand.
Is state shared revenue paying for local services like some of the ones you just mentioned?
Yeah, the appropriation the total appropriation has really not grown since the state decided to fund 2/3 of the cost of schools, and that's an average statewide figure. You know, it's sitting just under $1 billion, and that goes to counties and municipalities. Some municipalities, the ones that tend to be wealthier in terms of property value, had been getting ratcheted down, but by state law, but now everybody's more or less pretty much frozen.
Are you saying that, you know, police and fire and these other things should be paid out of local property tax, not by shared revenue?
Well, that's a whole other debate.
Okay.
You know, the state has decided it would subsidize these municipal services. I think you know, reasonable people can disagree on this, but you can certainly make a case that particularly in tax-based poor communities that simply don't have the oomph to generate the revenue, that you need some kind of state role to sort of put a floor under them. Do we really need, as a matter of state policy, to subsidize municipal services in every community? Probably not, if the truth be told, and that would put more on the property tax. But if the state's going to have a role in relieving property taxes, it would seem to me that it makes more sense to focus its efforts on technical colleges and schools and maybe even counties than municipalities, because at least with municipalities you can justify the property tax. And perhaps if we didn't have a property tax at all in some other area, then it would make more sense for municipalities to be a little bit more reliant on the property tax. And if that increases public understanding and awareness and maybe crabbiness, I'm for that. The more information, the more people, the better.
Well, who were some of the other bigger winners and losers in this budget, Todd?
Well, I mean, if you look at the actors, the governor was certainly a winner in the sense that what he had really proposed from the beginning was some significant revenue increases to expand health care coverage for low-income individuals. And he got that. So if that was sort of the centerpiece of his original budget, he got it. The way he wanted to pay for it, he didn't get entirely. He got a fair amount of cigarette and tobacco tax revenue, and whether that's reliable revenue or not is a whole other discussion, but he certainly got that. But he did not get what was called the oil tax or the doubling of the real estate transfer fee, and there was one other biggie, that hospital tax. He did not get those. And those same items, if you flip them over, might be what you would call what the Republicans, particularly in the Assembly, got, and that is they didn't want the oil tax, the doubling of the real estate transfer fee, and the hospital tax, and so in that respect, what they got was something they didn't, you know, they prevented, they didn't want. The Senate Democrats, it's harder to say, because in the end, as it was going to be from the very beginning, the ultimate discussions had to be between the governor and the Speaker of the Assembly, because that was ultimately going to determine whether a budget was going to become law or not. And in the end, that's what happened. I suggested back in February, March, that we just be realistic about this and not go through all the committee process and hearings and joint finance committee meetings for 3 months, and just put the governor and the Speaker in a room, and I think we could have had a budget, you know, back in April or May. That
didn't work.
Well, that's probably what finally happened. It just didn't happen until mid-October.
Okay.
So it's hard to say what the Senate really got out of this.
More important player between the Republican Assembly and the Democrat governor.
Yeah, I would say so. And I can only surmise that the Senate Democrats felt that way because within hours of the budget they sacked their leader and replaced her with someone else. So there apparently was grumbling in the Senate Democratic
So the Senate
caucus.
Democrats kind of a loser in this. A little
Probably
bit.
to some degree,
Yeah.
but you know, and I don't mean to suggest that one legislator is more effective than another. It just happens to be where they were sitting.
Exactly.
It happened to be a Republican Assembly Speaker and a Democratic governor who were ultimately going to determine the fate. If you think back to the Thompson administration, it was sort of the roles were reversed. It was Senator Koala, the Senate Majority Leader, the Democrat in the Senate, and ultimately Governor Thompson, and to some degree the Speaker, Republican Speaker. So.
Could we talk, we talked about spending in the budget. Can we talk a little bit about, were there any revenue enhancements?
Yeah.
Tax increases, fee increases,
Yeah,
major ones?
yeah.
Are there any?
It's funny when you look at the numbers in this budget again and again and again. You really come to the conclusion that the Assembly Republicans started here, the governor started here, and they ended up splitting the difference. In total money, they split the difference. On the levy limits, they split the difference. Okay. In many ways on revenue too. The governor had originally proposed for the next 2 years about $1.75 billion of new revenue. The Assembly had originally proposed about $250 million. Well, where did we end up? 700 and some million dollars. You know, not quite right in the middle, but pretty close. It included well, $411 million in various tobacco increases, some tax cuts that are delayed or phased in, so their effect in this budget is not great. But net, it meant that total tax increases were under $400 million. When they decided not to do the oil tax, they still had a transportation problem because we've been taking money out of the transportation fund. And in the end, they decided rather than create an oil tax or increase the gas tax, where we tend to be one of the higher states in the country, they looked at various transportation fees where, relatively speaking, were low in the country. So things like vehicle registration and titling and licensing and so forth, that was where the bulk of the fee increases were, and those were a little under $400 million as well. So when you put the two together, you know, you're between $700 and $800 million.
Right, and on that subject, you know, the renewing your tag for your car is up now to $75 from $55. Then you've got the extra $1 a pack for cigarettes.
Heavy
boating,
trucks.
Heavy trucks. Boating, budget adds between $1.25 and $11 to boat registration fees, depending on, you know, the size of your motor and the boat size. According to Associated Press, even if you don't drive or smoke, just sitting at home in the dark is going to cost more. They say the average property tax on a medium valued home is expected to increase $80 this year and another $18 the following year.
The way we think about this is probably a little different. Rather than look at the median value home, we just say, what's the total property tax take going to be, and how much is it going to rise? And my guess is that when all is said and done, the gross levy statewide will probably be up around 5%. And the reason is that although the municipalities and counties will probably come in, you know, in the 3% range, technical colleges typically have led the pack, and I suspect they'll be up a fair amount. One of the things the governor took out of the budget was the levy limit on tech colleges. School aids, ironically, the amount of increase in school aids in this budget is not dramatically large. And because of the way the whole school funding thing works, when aids grow less, then districts are allowed to raise more property taxes. So school levies are going to be up more, probably on average, more than 5%. But when you put it all together, I would guess, you know, something in the 5% range gross. And I haven't done the exact calculations, but maybe something in the 4 to 5% range after state tax credits. So, which is about where we were last year.
Well, you know, everything keeps going up. Every year we keep seeing more and more with the county, the city, the school district, you know, the colleges. Everybody's individual portion of our tax bill, it seems, continues to go up every single year. And yet, you know, they say we got to hold the line on taxes. Nobody seems to be doing that, though. So what is the answer to get that accomplished, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to concede that inflation is out there. Which is part of what's driving things. It's not an insignificant factor even in healthcare costs. I would say that if you're going to rethink budgets, you sort of have to redo some thinking fundamentally. And one thing you have to think about is, does Wisconsin have to be one of the top 10 states in the country in terms of the number of units of local government? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm actually a big fan of local control, but I would argue if you have so many units of local government, you probably have less local control because there are so many local units that they just sort of overlap and contradict each other. So, I mean, there's certainly that issue. Another one that is painful to mention, but is a biggie out there, is when you look at what distinguishes the public sector in Wisconsin from the public sector in other states and the private sector here, is our fringe benefits, our health, our retirement, everything here is a much larger share of our public budgets than it is in other states. Minnesota, for instance. We have really good data from the federal government on schools, and we know our benefits are third highest in the country. Minnesota's 26th. And yet Minnesota's salaries are higher than ours. So it's those kinds of things that are really touchy and painful. I mean, because people like what they have, they like the status quo, they want to protect their turf. But those are the kinds of sort of fundamental things you have to talk about if you really, you know, want to change things.
And they're very painful, and regionalism is probably constitutional, and you're not going to get a teachers union to vote on lower health care benefits.
No, no.
Yeah, so those are tough.
Tough, yeah, yeah. I think the benefit issue, particularly in schools, is slowly evolving because local teachers unions are figuring out that with the limit on their compensation that's put on by the state, their benefits are growing and their salaries aren't.
No salary increases at all?
Not a lot, no.
Mainly the insurance.
And so, you know, particularly for younger teachers, the starting salaries aren't rising as they might have in the past, and they're not particularly interested in their health insurance or their retirement, given their age.
That's a good point.
But there's evidence in districts scattered around the state that local boards and local unions are jointly recognizing this phenomenon and are finding ways to come to grips with
the co-payments have increased substantially.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, the most unusual thing has been in Manitowoc County, where the county executive, who's also state representative, Bob Ziegelbauer, went to, you know, health savings accounts and then used county money to fund the deductibles. And I was in northern Wisconsin, and much to my surprise, a school superintendent said to me, yeah, we're in the midst of trying to do the same thing. And I know that there are a number of other school districts that are shopping their programs. In other words, going into the market and saying, you know, compete. And there are some districts that have been extraordinarily successful at that. I happen to live in one in suburban Madison, whose health insurance premiums are among the very lowest in school districts, among school districts in the state. More than half the statewide average. Why? Because they really force the providers to compete.
You know, talking about reducing taxes, holding the line on taxes at the very least, I'm sure that you're familiar with these meetings that are being held around the state called the Wisconsin Way. On a recent show, we had the pleasure of talking with some folks about that program. You know, not to diss or promote them, but do you think that that kind of a concept in theory is a good idea? Do you think it has, you know, the possibility of accomplishing its goal?
I'm both going to be favorable, and I'm also maybe rain on the parade a little bit. The favorable remark would be, again, anything that gets a generally disengaged public involved in public discussion, I am for. And I don't care how they drag them to these meetings, you know, by their hair, kicking and screaming, whatever. I think we only benefit when we have public dialogue and public education, because people who maybe don't follow an issue day to day suddenly realize that there are other factors going on, and they can make more intelligent decisions. If there's a part of this to, I guess, maybe be a little cynical about, I served on the Kettle Commission in 2000-2001. I served on several legislative council task forces on school aids and local government funding. A ledge council committee that made some really good recommendations to clean up the state's finances in 2002. And I could go on. Nothing happens with those.
They're all in the shelf, aren't
and
they?
those are institutional. I mean, those are already part of state government. And the impetus for these discussions seems to be we would like more services, and we don't want to pay for them with the property tax. And when you reduce that to political solutions, as all these various bodies, and I forgot to mention the Governor's Task Force on Education, as all these bodies have done, in the end, nothing has changed. And one of the unfortunate things about the shaky finances of state government over the last decade is there's no extra money to try to change anything. If you want to change school aids, if you want to reform state taxes, you're probably going to have winners, you're probably going to have losers, and when in good times, when you have money, a little money on the side, you can essentially pay off the losers to create a transition to something new and different. That's probably one of the most regretful parts of the last 10 years is it really has frozen any kind of talk of change or reform or innovation or whatever, because there's just no money.
Well, I think that's one of the things that we had talked about after the show a little bit was, you know, just here you do have the Kettle Commission, and really, I mean, and they've said that themselves on the show, is that nothing really came to fruition as a result of that. And there was a lot of time and effort and money spent on it. And, you know, what guarantee is there that anything from this at all is going to, you know, I'm sure something will come forward, but whether or not it is realized in the form of tax savings.
I think Todd's point that the official ones couldn't get it passed. Our concern was this was sort of a collage of unofficial. I mean, official in their own right, but they had no standing. And so that seemed to make it more difficult.
That makes it harder. My own view, having served in the executive branch in the 70s and early 80s, and then been on a county board and a school board and been away from government for a while, is that if you want fundamental change at the state level, the only way it happens is you have to have a governor be elected on a mandate and then lead from that mandate. If you look back, Pat Lucey, a Democrat, when he came in 1971, that is when university merger happened. It was ugly, the fight, but it happened. That is when we really redid our state aid formulas, with winners and losers, but there was money to deal with it. When Governor Dreyfus came in the late 70s, he had a mandate to change some aspects of state tax law, and it happened. We also then got hit by a really severe recession, but it happened. I would say in the case of Governor Thompson, the thing that he focused on most over his multiple terms was probably welfare reform, and whether you agree with what happened or not, we really fundamentally changed the way we do that. So in every case you had a governor coming in new with an electoral mandate, and I don't see that right now. Either that or you have to have an extraordinarily entrenched, powerful Senate leader or Assembly Speaker. Maybe you could move it that way, but at the rate the legislature has been throwing out its leaders, I mean, the Senate flips from Republican to Democrat almost every 2 years, and within those caucuses they throw out their leaders, maybe multiple times in a session, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side. So I guess my own view is that if something's going to happen, it's probably going to be with a governor running on some kind of program and saying, I want to do this, and the public reacting and it happening.
Do you see Governor Doyle running a third term?
I don't know. I'm not a pundit.
We are. That's why we asked this question.
Yeah. I guess I would have thought until this year, I would have said no. I mean, he gave no indications that he wanted to, to serve more than 2 terms, other than Governor Thompson. That's been sort of, tradition, as it is, well, as it was at the federal level, and then of course we got a constitutional change. But the messages that have been sent in the last year have been more mixed. There's a very good, smart reason for Governor Doyle to do that, and that is he wants to retain some power in the bully pulpit, and by keeping everybody guessing, he remains powerful, if you will, through his second term. But I don't know.
Sure.
He's, he's in his 60s now, so I believe, so maybe early 60s. So, by a third term, I would think he'd be in his late 60s, early 70s. I don't remember the exact age. Now, with Ronald Reagan and John McCain, age doesn't matter as much, perhaps. But I don't think any of us want to work flat out when we're 68, 70, 72. Maybe we'd like to do something, but not marching in every parade from Kenosha to Superior.
Did you have anything else?
I want to talk about the future, but
okay.
Go ahead.
I think your group came out with if I'm correct, sort of Wisconsin the next 15, 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you just share some of those highlights with
us. I really appreciate you asking that, because I think it's the most important problem facing the state, and I also believe that our political leaders, none of them appear to be aware of it or are doing anything to prepare. And the problem in a nutshell is that what's happening demographically now and for the next 10, 20 years, the senior population is going to double, thanks to
us.
All of us.
The school-age population has been dropping. Statewide, we've been losing a few K-12 students every year. Now, play that out. What happens? Well, our high school populations are starting to shrink. We peaked a few years ago. Those folks are entering college, and then they enter the workforce, or they go directly into work. the labor force in Wisconsin is projected to shrink in the next few years. You have employers in some parts of the state that are very concerned already that there won't be an adequate supply of the kind of skilled labor they need to help run their businesses that may be, a little more complicated. Plus we have had this tendency in recent years, at least this is what we found in another study, is we have been losing people in the 20 to 30 range, particularly in the higher education levels, because frankly there are just more jobs at higher pay levels in places like Chicago or Minneapolis. Well, you put all this together, and it's something I think we should really be concerned about. It means in some parts of the state we've really got to give local schools some terrific flexibility in thinking how they're going to continue to work with a lot fewer students. And in some cases we can't say merge. When you've got a district that covers a ton of square miles, maybe with a half a kid per square mile, you can't merge them with another district that looks just like it. Right. I mean, unless you want kids riding buses 4 or 5 hours a day. So we've got to think about that. How do you think about labor shortage or inadequate supplies of certain kinds of labor? And obviously the politics changes when the group that is most likely to vote, seniors, becomes a larger and larger percentage of the population. And everybody to some degree votes their own interests. So it's a biggie.
Okay. Just in a very, very short moment or two, you're a nonpartisan group. Okay. How does the Wisconsin Taxpayer Alliance get funded?
Sure. This, by the way, is our 75th anniversary this year, and we are privately funded. Roughly half of our operating revenues come from gifts from individuals, firms, foundations, unions, local government, school districts, that kind of stuff. We also have an endowment, which in good years we don't have to take money from, but in bad years is certainly there as a source of revenue. We also, in many ways, are part publishing house, part consulting firm. We have a bi-weekly newsletter, a monthly magazine, we have annual reference guides on municipal government schools, on and on. So, and we do a little bit of consulting for local governments. Okay,
great. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Hope to have you back
Very
again.
knowledgeable. Thank you for a wonderful show.
All right, and thanks, Dan. Thanks as always to you for having us in your homes for the last hour. We'll see you real soon. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.